And before this video begins, I'd just like to give a special thank you to my Asban Team level patron, Fallon Cortez. Thank you for supporting the channel. Doctor Who is an expansive and wonderful franchise with a universe of limitless potential. What if scenarios are incredibly easy to think of and explore? There are all sorts of ideas. What if David Tennant was in Series 5? What if Kronk burgers were vegan? What if the 9th Doctor stayed for Series 2? Oh, hang on a minute. Oh look, a very handsome, successful and smart YouTuber already did that one. And of course, there's the classic trope, what if the Doctor was evil? Well, I'm sorry, I have to break it to you, that's actually already happened quite a long time ago. And yes, it was within the show itself. And no, I'm not talking about the Master's shenanigans in Power of the Doctor, or even the 10th or 12th Doctors going rogue in their time. I'm talking about the Valeyard, the incredibly evil incarnation of the lead character introduced in season 23 as the main antagonist. The mere existence and premise of the Valeyard is still quite mysterious and a bit shaky even to this day, but that hasn't stopped fans from speculating or predicting a potential return. So today I thought I'd take a look at this villain and how he might be able to return to terrorise the heroic Doctor once more. So without any further ado, what if the Valeyard returned? As I mentioned, the Valeyard was introduced in season 23, Trial of a Time Lord. This storyline sees the Doctor captured and put on trial by his own people, with the mysterious Valeyard serving as the prosecutor in exchange for the Doctor's 7 remaining regenerations. The Valeyard repeatedly shows evidence of the crimes in question, although it eventually transpires that he has manipulated the evidence and tampered to ensure a guilty verdict and therefore to get those regenerations. It then turns out that this particular evil Time Lord is actually the Doctor himself, or at least an amalgamation of his darker aspects taken from between his 12th and final incarnation. His exact nature is still unclear, there's never been a decisive explanation of his origins or how and why he exists to begin with, but that actually works in our favour here because it's something quite flexible. There have been different origin stories and attempted explanations in his subsequent audio dramas and books, but nothing within the show itself, meaning there's no strict lore we have to adhere to. But where is the Valeyard now? What happened to him during season 23, and is the door even still open for a return? So, after terrorising the Doctor during his trial and pushing him to his limits, the Valeyard's true nature is revealed and the Doctor has to battle him within the Time Lord Matrix with the unlikely support of the Master. After fighting through lots of illusions, the Doctor defeats the Valeyard and the crisis is over, although the final scene reveals the survival of the Valeyard, who is disguised as the Keeper of the Matrix. But that was it for the character within the show. He never appeared again, despite regular fan speculation and desire to see him return. Like I mentioned, he appeared in some books and audio dramas, with Big Finish bringing him into the Time War, because of course they did. At this point I wouldn't even be surprised if we got the War Roomba, hoovering up the mess of all the Time Lords. The Valeyard's last appearance in Big Finish saw his mind being damaged to the extent he genuinely believed he was the heroic Doctor, and therefore he became a heroic figure fighting the Daleks in a time loop, refusing to leave the planet because it would lead him to become the Valeyard again. So he chose to remain trapped, and that's the last we've heard of him, having this bit of a redemption arc. And of course, before we go any further, there is a bit of an elephant in the room with Valeyard actor Michael Jaston passing away earlier this year. The Valeyard is implied to be a single villainous incarnation of the Doctor, so without Jaston to play the role, it's hard for the character to return under those pretenses. Given this and the sheer gap in time between appearances, I think a Valeyard return would have to take the form of a reimagining or a new origin story, which I know would be controversial, but I think it's the only real way to do it. And besides, we currently live in a period of time where they seem to want to do everything controversial anyway. So at this point, depending on your approach and your willingness to adhere to established continuity,
I am the Doctor. I'm a good doctor. I'm a bad doctor. Yeah. Anyway.
The Valeyard is a hard entity to bring back to Doctor Who. The character is a relic of a maligned era, with an open-ended stinger ending or a bittersweet redemption ending in expanded media. His origins are confusing and contradictory, and his actor is sadly no longer with us. So it leaves the Valeyard in a bit of a limbo of sorts. He can't come back in the same form he was introduced in, or under the same premise.
You are elevating futility to a high art.
But in my opinion, the door still does remain open for a general return. The Valeyard was mentioned in both Name of the Doctor and Twice Upon a Time, showrunner Stephen Moffat using the villain's legacy as a reminder of the Doctor's inner darkness. And some fans have always speculated that the so-called Dream Lord is a version of, or spiritual successor to, the Valeyard after he also appeared as a representation or amalgamation of the Doctor's darker sides. So there's definitely still a potential foundation to build upon for his return. But if I was to bring him back, I would draw upon a plot from much earlier in modern Doctor Who, something that changed everything and seemed to wrap up with a happy ending. I think the new Valeyard should be the Meta-Crisis Doctor.
It's you!
Oh yes.
Okay, so hear me out for a bit. As we all know, the big story arc of Series 4 was all about the Doctor Donna, with the finale seeing the 10th Doctor regenerate into himself, and the resultant energy stored in his disembodied hand creating the meta-crisis between the Doctor and Donna, forming into a separate human version of the 10th Doctor. This Meta-Crisis Doctor eventually settled down with Rose Tyler in the parallel Earth known as Pete's World, and that's where we left them, with a couple of small inconsequential stories here and there picking up on their domestic life afterwards, but nothing hugely significant. But here's where I want to direct you towards a bit of an interesting tidbit. So we all consider David Tennant's first incarnation of the Doctor to be the 10th Doctor, right? You know, it's a fair assumption, it's what everyone calls him, it's the numbering system the show works with. After all, you know, he was the 10th incarnation to show up on screens, so therefore he is the 10th Doctor. But then that all changed with the War Doctor between the 8th Doctor and the 9th Doctor, shifting what we refer to as the 10th Doctor to actually become the 11th Doctor in the true numbering scheme. You know, that's not a huge deal, it's just one extra digit and, you know, we can live with that. It's a minor numerical shift. But then the Meta-Crisis happens, which Time of the Doctor later explains as being an entire incarnation, you know, counting as its own separate thing.
My number 10 once regenerated and kept the same face. I had vanity issues at the time.
So that technically makes the Meta-Crisis the 12th incarnation of the Doctor. It's all very confusing, obviously, but remember that initial claim of the Valeyard being from between the Doctor's 12th and final incarnation? So, by the most technical of technicalities, the Meta-Crisis Doctor does indeed just about fit within the range, just enough for him to potentially be the Valeyard. And the other main thing, he has no future regenerations. He's a human Time Lord hybrid with all his existing memories and his Time Lord brain, with a human lifespan and no ability to regenerate. And that kind of mortality would terrify Time Lord, especially as they feel themselves getting older with no safety net. So the Meta-Crisis Doctor is our Valeyard, but how would that story actually go? Let's say this two-part story takes place with the 15th, current Doctor, for obvious continuity reasons. He's up to his usual adventures in time and space, doing his thing as he currently is on our screens. But then the TARDIS goes haywire and crashes, much like it did back in Rise of the Cybermen, but without completely shutting it down this time because of plot reasons that will soon become clear. So the 15th Doctor once again finds himself in the so-called Pete's World, and he soon comes across Corin, or John Smith, as the Meta-Crisis Doctor calls himself in different types of stories. It's very inconsistent. He'd look pretty different by now, having a beard and slightly longer hair to reflect the passage of time and how he's human and aging normally. You know, he'd basically just look like quarantine David Tennant. At first, it's a fun reunion, like a multi-Doctor story, as they catch up and get up to no good, solving a mystery and experiencing all kinds of parallel world shenanigans and just kind of enjoying the moment. As with all multi-Doctor stories, their personalities would clash here and there, and the slightly darker, morally dubious, questionable decisions of Corin would contrast with the Doctor's own. but that would originally just be hand-waved away as typical multi-Doctor bickering like we've always seen. Then towards the end, the 15th Doctor allows Corin to step into the TARDIS to reminisce on the good old days, with Corin emotionally reuniting with the time machine he remembers so fondly. But then, suddenly, somehow he knocks the 15th Doctor out and hijacks the time machine, hoping to escape the parallel world and steal the Doctor's ability to regenerate, so he can be free of that human mortality he has learned to dread and hate. It turns out that he actually brought the TARDIS back to Pete's world to begin with, using technobabble Time Lord stuff to drag the time machine across dimensions so he could steal it from the man who trapped him in exile and walked off into the future he believed belonged to him. You know, there was a deleted scene at the end of Journey's End which suggested the Metacrisis Doctor and Rose would be able to grow their own TARDIS, and in this situation, you know, that would have somehow failed, and the Metacrisis Doctor would have used that piece of grow your own TARDIS DIY kit to drag the one from our universe over to his so he could steal that instead. And thus, we have the Valeyard. At some point between the events of the comic Empire of the Wolf and this hypothetical story, Corin would have grown bitter and discontent with his human life. This is something already actually kind of seeded within Big Finish audios, with Corin less rational than the Doctor and less forgiving, along with only being able to think about fire and war sometimes, giving him headaches because, you know, he's got this kind of PTSD from his time in the Time War still. I feel like over the years this would have festered and corrupted him, with Corin giving in to his more human side and those negative emotions that are in the human psyche more than the Time Lord psyche. And of course, because of all his past lives, you could suggest he forms a sense of regenerative dissonance like I've made a video about before, where he still has all of his past selves in his head constantly yapping on and taking over his mind, making himself go insane. Therefore, by the time the 15th Doctor meets him, Corin's relationship with Rose has completely crumbled, with Rose leaving him and taking their daughter Mia, no longer recognising the man she fell in love with. And this loss of the woman he did all of this sacrificing for and moved to a whole parallel world to live with would further Corin's spiral, making him feel more trapped and alone within this world he doesn't actually care about. So he begins to formulate his plan to hijack Unit's resources to steal the TARDIS, and also the Doctor's regenerations. Returning to the main universe, Corin, or as we now know him, the Valeyard, keeps the Doctor restrained and travels the universe, saving people and planets in corrupted, evil ways. Come to think of it, not unlike the Master in Power of the Doctor.
I am a doctor, and I caused this.
Let's say he gets real wacky with it and even kills one of the Doctor's good allies, be that Kate Stewart or the companion of that series, really driving home the threat Corin poses if he's able to achieve his plan. And of course, in the ruins of Gallifrey, he creates a chameleon arch machine thing capable of restoring his Time Lord biology by using the Time Lord Matrix, you know, tying it all back to his original first appearance in the show. Of course, the plan he is trying to do can't actually be done, but Corin is lost in his delusions and desperation to escape his exile. Despite the Doctor's pleading and reasoning trying to get him to see the light, Corin begins the process, seemingly tearing himself apart and leaving the Doctor to reflect upon Corin's fall from grace and the loss of his friends. The Doctor would also reflect upon Corin being a product of himself, his own blood and his own mind, meaning that same darkness is still within himself, even if it's buried deep within. And of course, because Corin or the Valeyard would have been torn apart and the Matrix would have been involved, you still have some plausible deniability saying that, you know, somehow he then becomes the Valeyard as we know him from season 23. So there's enough, you know, flexibility there that you can keep both stories. Okay, yes, so I already know what you're planning on commenting, and yes, there is immediately a huge problem with this hypothetical situation. The 14th Doctor. Yes, it's kind of hard to bring David Tennant back as a big subversive villain when he's already recently been back to the show in a significant role, since he returned as the 14th Doctor for the 60th anniversary specials. So having him return as the Metacrisis Doctor who therefore becomes the Valeyard would not have nearly the same effect as it otherwise would have had. Of course, you could still tell the same general story but with the 14th Doctor himself, since he also settled down to live a normal life, with bi-generation still murky and pliable enough to potentially make it all work. However, the 14th Doctor already has his own TARDIS and he is able to regenerate, with the implication that he does still become the 15th Doctor, so it wouldn't really work. And also, admittedly, there's just the simple fact that we're all a bit sick of David Tennant by this point, and a potential return to Doctor Who in any form would garner more eye-rolling than anything else. This wouldn't have been the case before the 60th specials, but now that those have come and gone and they left another stray David Tennant Doctor out there in the universe, we can't bring him back as the Valeyard. So that plan, as much as I've always liked it, is sadly a bust, in my opinion at least. So what about alternative ideas? Well, how about we have a new rogue Time Lord enemy introduced at the start of a series, who then continues to plague the Doctor throughout those episodes. We assume it's someone familiar to us like the Master or the Rani because it seems obvious. They're the opposite in style and personality to the 15th Doctor, creating a very interesting dichotomy and contrast between the characters. However, we then discover that the figure is none other than the Valeyard themselves, trying to thwart the Doctor every step and take his regenerations. The Valeyard could even become a recurring villain throughout the entire era, a fresh break from the constant reliance on the Master as the only Time Lord renegade we deal with. Or another idea, they could just get all blockbuster with it. The enigmatic origins and placement of the Valeyard means it's an incarnation of the Doctor nobody has to commit to. You don't need to ensure they can fit into future continuity or appear again when it's their turn to become the Doctor. So for a special, or even to be ambitious, a movie, they can cast a big name, high profile actor to play the Valeyard in a one-off appearance, similar to John Hurt in Day of the Doctor. We'd have a similar situation to the Dream Lord, where the Doctor is up against this darker, bizarro world version of himself, someone who can beat him at his own game and counter his every strategy, leading to a very interesting back and forth. So what would this alternative plot be? I have a few different ideas. First of all, we could have the Doctor encountering murmurings and rumours of a tyrannical empire on the rise, with his own name starting to conjure more fear than hope. Eventually, he finds out that one of his own future incarnations has used his reputation and name to manipulate others and build this empire of the Valeyard. The Valeyard sends agents back in time to capture and imprison the Doctor's previous incarnations, hoping to safely destroy them thanks to a paradox machine. The 15th Doctor is forced to confront this empire and defeat it, all whilst confronting his own future and the potential inevitability of it, him therefore becoming the villain down the line. Or maybe you could instead go all psychological and thematic with it, with the Valeyard appearing within the Doctor's own mind and his psyche and forcing him to fight an internal battle as the companions and allies have to deal with a different threat on the outside. In the Doctor's mind, he'd be confronted with his regrets and guilts in his life, all his dark moments, with the Valeyard seeking to break him completely and force him to give the Valeyard a physical presence in this plane of the universe, almost like a possession story of sorts. The Doctor is forced to relive some of those darkest days as the Valeyard offers to take the pain away for him by essentially replacing him. It would be a fascinating character piece within the Doctor's own psychology, with all sorts of interesting visuals and creative artistic direction, something similar to Nightmare in Silver, but done a little bit better obviously. That could be a great Valeyard story, keeping his existence very ambiguous and abstract. Or hey, you could instead just go full Marvel slop and have the Valeyard emerging as the leader of an army made up of alternate universe Doctors from different realities. And the whole thing just evolves into a mess of bodies and CGI, because I guess that's the future of our media, is all multiverse crap. The Valeyard is a fascinating character who is still very ambiguous and up for interpretation. He's a character whose existence changes everything we thought we knew and understood about the Doctor, suggesting that he genuinely has it within him to become a purely evil character. Yet we barely even know anything about the Valeyard, and we don't even know if we can trust his origins, since he's the only one to claim them to begin with when he appears in Trial of a Time Lord. All of this means he can very easily be reintroduced within Doctor Who under new pretenses without interfering too much with pre-existing lore and continuity, since it wouldn't take too much to explain how he existed back in season 23 with a different face. You could completely reboot him like my initial idea of the Meta-Crisis Doctor, or you could use his continuing presence as the chance to tell an Amy's Choice-esque psychological story diving deep into the Doctor's darker identity and psyche.
There's only one person in the universe who hates me as much as you do.
I think there's a wealth of potential there, especially because it could allow the casting of a high-profile actor to play a one-off villainous future incarnation like this without needing any commitment to a full series that, stops most big-name actors becoming a regular incarnation of the Doctor. Of course, by this point, the Valiard is a bit of a deep cut to try and bring back, so it probably won't ever happen because it's just kind of one of those cases of it was a decent idea in the past, but you just gotta let it go because to bring it back would need so much explanation, especially if he was the Meta-Crisis Doctor, because then you got to explain two whole different things. So none of this will probably ever happen, but it's still an interesting thing to speculate about, especially when Doctor Who has attempted similar characters since then. These were just some of my ideas on what might happen if he returned, kind of like a what if scenario and seeing how that would affect the Doctor in the current timeline, but I'm sure you have your own ideas. So let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. And I'd just like to give an extra special thank you to my Asbantium level patron Fallon Cortez, my Platinum level patron Matthew Burns, and all my Gold level patrons Chris Douglas, Daniel Shillito, Thomas Zar, and the 3 Railway Engines. Thank you so much for your support.